Good afternoon, everybody. This is Michael Staub. As Kelly mentioned, I am one of the co-CEOs of Innovative Arc Strategies, and we are excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today a little bit about generic drugs and what is happening in the market. This is an area that has really received a lot of attention probably in the last few weeks to the last couple of months as generic drugs have continued to skyrocket. In fact, if any of you are in the Boston area, the front page article on Friday was about the high cost of generic drugs and the fact that they are skyrocketing. And even today there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the same issue. So what we want to do today is kind of talk to you a little bit about about generic drugs, and we'll kind of go through our presentation, kind of hopefully giving you some information or some things to think about going forward as it relates to generic drugs. But before we begin, kind of doing an overview of what we're going to cover, I just wanted to ask a question of everybody about, have any of you started to experience an increase in your generic drug costs as a self-insured or as an employer, if you're a health plan or anything like that, if you're joining? If you could vote and just kind of give us an idea about what your experience would be great. Okay, it looks about 75% of you have experienced some increase in generic drugs. So that is probably on par. And let's talk a little bit about. We'll go through the slides here and what we're going to cover today. The first thing we're going to cover is really, what is a generic drug? Most of you have a definition probably, or should have a definition in your PBM contract about what is a generic drug, depending upon whether or not the PBM uses Medispan or First Data Bank, but we'll talk a little bit about what a generic drug is. Greg will also talk a little bit about the bioequivalent and therapeutically equivalent requirements for a generic drug as opposed, or comparing it to a brand drug. The other thing that really is kind of a mystery, I think, for a lot of people is what is a MAC list? And Greg is probably, if you have any questions about MAC lists, is probably the best person to ask your questions, because Greg was responsible for managing the MAC list at CVS Caremark for a long time. So there's a lot of mystery. There's a lot that goes into the creation of a MAC list and how many different MAC lists a PBM has or uses with clients. We'll talk a little bit about that. The next thing we'll talk about is single source and authorized generics, and really how those, what those are and how they come into play as it relates to your pricing under your PBM contract. And I think that then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what you may want to consider from a plan design perspective to increase generic utilization. The other thing we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about is generic drug price inflation. Why is that occurring? How does that impact your pricing? What are some of the strategies that you should be considering now to mitigate the impact of high-cost generic drugs as they increase in cost? And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about biosimilars, and are biosimilars the panacea for high-cost specialty drugs? There's the first biosimilar was just launched in the last couple weeks. I know there are several that are waiting for approval, but the question is really what impact will those biosimilars have on the high cost of specialty drugs, and the impact that they will have on your future drug costs. And at the end, Greg will summarize a little bit about on key takeaways from today's presentation.
All right, thanks, Michael. So the big question is really, what is a generic drug, right? How do these things come into being, and where do they come into place? And the Drug Price Competition and Patent Terms Restoration Act, it's a big word for this, in 1984, which is commonly known really as the Hatch-Waxman Act, which is really Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah and Representative Henry Waxman of California put this together to kind of create the ability to actually market a generic product, right? So the brand products, the innovative brand products, the FDA has typically given them about a 20-year patent protection on their products. So when they first introduce it with a new drug application about what's going on, they get a 20-year patent right on that new drug. And typically it takes them sometimes up to 15 years to actually get the product onto the market. And so they're only left with maybe, 5-10 years worth of, use of that drug to actually recover all the research and development costs to actually get it to market. So that's why they're really giving them this patent protection. But once that patent is up, then drug companies have the ability to really put a generic drug product on the market. But they need to submit something called a new abbreviated new drug application, an ANDA. So that's really important that the drug manufacturers that want to put a generic on the market have to submit an ANDA to the FDA then to get approval for that, to market that generic on the marketplace. Now, for the FDA, right, when it looks at what's going to be able to get approval for these generics, they have to meet certain criteria, right? It's got to have the same active ingredient as the innovator brand. So it can't be something different. It's got to be the same strength, dosage form, and route of administration. So if it's taken orally, it's got to be taken orally, right? It's all got to be the same thing. It's got to have the same indications as the innovator brand has, and it's got to be bioequivalent. And we'll talk a little bit more about bioequivalent, what all that means, but that's really important. It's got to meet the same batch standards, right? It's got to have the same, identity, the strength, purity of the product, all that's got to come through, and it's got to be manufactured in the same strict standards that the innovator brand was produced. So when you think about bioequivalent versus therapeutically equivalent, what's kind of the difference between the two? Now, when you think about a generic drug, since the brand name drug has already gone through all these clinical trials, right, and been approved, that it's actually safe and effective, the generic doesn't have to replicate that. The FDA already says, yes, this product, this chemical works, it is safe, it is effective for what it does. So what the generic drug manufacturers have to do then is to prove that their generic that they're putting on the market is bioequivalent or A-rated to that innovator brand drug. Well, so what's that actually mean? It means it's got to deliver the same amount of active ingredient into that patient's bloodstream in the same amount of time. So, some of you, for example, have gotten prescriptions, right, that may have, sometimes you take the drug once daily, sometimes you'll take it twice daily, sometimes you'll have to take it 4 times a day. Sometimes the directions will say take it every 4 hours. Now, why are you having all those different directions? Well, it has to do with the level of the drug in your bloodstream. So that's really what's important, right, is how that all works. It's got to have that same active ingredient, and it's got to meet the same level of active ingredient in the bloodstream in the same amount of time. But that's what creates this kind of subset of drugs then called these narrow therapeutic index drugs. So there's this window in your bloodstream, if you can imagine, that the drug has to reach certain concentrations to be effective. So that's called they have this narrow window that they need to meet and follow through on that. Now, it used to be Dilantin, phenytoin, the generic for Dilantin when that first came out, which is used for epilepsy, was considered a narrow therapeutic index drug. The drug had to meet a certain blood level to be effective, and so that that's what kind of classified those. And depending on some states may not allow pharmacies to substitute for narrow therapeutic index drugs. But another key piece about this bioequivalent, right? It's got to perform in the same manner. It's got to work the same way as the brand drug. It's got to meet that same purity standards. And if it does meet all that, then it's allowed to be substituted for that brand name drug, right? But there are, in some cases, like in Florida, for example, there's considered some negative formularies. And a negative formulary is really something that even though the FDA has said that these drugs are bioequivalent, that they don't allow substitution for those things. It used to be in Florida, used to not allow substitution for Synthroid. They've changed that recently because levothyroxine, they've agreed that levothyroxine or generic Synthroid is substitutable to the brand. But there still are some controlled release products, things that get released over time in your system that are still on the list of being on the negative formulary. So in Florida, for example, the pharmacies are not allowed to substitute those, and they'll submit a specific dispense as written code, which we'll talk about a little later, that doesn't allow them to substitute those products. Now, what's the difference between bioequivalent, though, and therapeutically equivalent? Well, if something's therapeutically equivalent, it contains a different active ingredient. So, for example, you think about Lipitor and Crestor. They're two statin drugs that are used to lower cholesterol. right? But they have different active ingredients, right? The chemical active ingredient in Lipitor is called atorvastatin. The active ingredient in Crestor is called revastatin. So either way, right, they're both statin drugs, but they're different ingredients. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're therapeutically equivalent because they're going to have the same kind of effect and side effect profile once they hit the system, once you take them into your body. But when it's therapeutically equivalent, though, the pharmacy can't automatically substitute that. If they want to do a therapeutic interchange, they need to get a hold of the physician, and the physician needs to give approval for that to happen. So now when you think about MAC lists, we have a question here that we'd like to have you guys answer or talk about. And it really is, how many MAC lists do you think your PBM has, right? Do they have 1, 2, 5, more than 10? And how many MAC lists do you think your PBM actually has? Because when you think about MAC, or maximum allowable cost, so that's what that MAC stands for, it's really a price. So a MAC list is really a listing of classes of generic drugs that all have a price on them, and the price is really done at a per unit basis, and it's really the price that the PBM typically will pay a pharmacy, or in a lot of cases will charge you, the client, right? It'll what they charge you and what they pay the pharmacy on a per price basis. So when you think about the MAC pricing, though, in some respects, it correlates to an AWP discount. So for example, say you have something that's got a generic drug that's got an AWP on it, average wholesale price of $1, but the MAC price on it is 10 cents. So that correlates to an AWP discount of AWP minus 90%, right? 10 divided by 100, kind of thing. So you get a 90% discount on that. So MAC is a price. It's not a discount, but it correlates to an AWP discount as you look at it. So it's something to think about as you go forward. Typically, all the bioequivalent generics within the same category have the same MAC price. So there's something in the industry that's called a generic code number, a GCN, and that really groups kind of all the generics by strength, formulation, and route of administration. And then the generics all within that same GPN will have the same price. So for example, you get amoxicillin 250 milligram capsules, right? So all the amoxicillin 250 milligram capsules will have the same GCN, they'll get the same MAC price, regardless of the package size that the pharmacy buys it in. If they buy it in bottles of 100 or bottles of 500, it's still going to get the same MAC price associated with it. So that price is typically not associated with, within the GCN. But there is some criteria, though, that what does it take for a generic then to qualify to be on a MAC list? And again, the list is really those classes of generics, that meet the specific criteria for inclusion on the list. So there's different classes of generics that meet it. But the generics typically have to be available from 2 or more manufacturers. So there's got to be some competition out in the marketplace for that to meet it. It has to be an A-rated equivalent to the innovator brand, right? On the last thing we talked about bioequivalence, that A-rated equivalent. It's got to be A-rated to be on the MAC list, and it's got to be available in all markets. So you can't just get it, in Florida. It's got to be available everywhere for it really to qualify to be on the MAC list. Now, typically, if it doesn't qualify to be on the MAC list, then it's going to be considered non-MAC'd, right? And typically, the non-MAC'd generics receive the brand discount. That's kind of typically how that works.
And one thing I wanted to point out on the MAC list criteria, it's also important in terms of the definition in your contract about what is the definition of a MAC list, or how many drugs, the generic drugs, does it take to be considered on the MAC list. I mean, typically what you would expect to see is 2 or more manufacturers, but I've seen some PBM contracts where it's 3 or more. So it's really important to understand, how that PBM determines how many generic drugs that are available in the market make up or constitute a drug that's on the MAC list. Because if it's 3 or more, then that could be a negative for you in terms of the pricing. So it's one of those things that a lot of times gets kind of brushed over and people don't pay attention to when they should, in terms of how many drugs are required to be considered to be a drug on the MAC list, or generic drugs are considered to be on a MAC list. And Greg, can you talk a little bit about, I know that from the poll results, about a third of the respondents thought that most PBMs only have one MAC list. Can you generally talk about how many MAC lists they have and why that makes a difference to the client when it comes to a pricing standpoint based upon the MAC list that the PBM has and how they impact the client?
Yeah, so PBMs really manage in a lot of cases numerous different MAC lists. They'll have, if you have a traditional kind of spread arrangement with the PBM, most likely the MAC list that they have for you is very different than the MAC list of which they use to pay the pharmacies, because they're making a spread in between what they charge you and what they pay the pharmacies. So you think about the difference in that. Now they could have a different MAC list that they apply for their Medicare business. They could have a different MAC list that they use on their cash card business. They could have a different MAC list, for different groupings of things. So there's really multiple MAC lists that a PBM will use and apply, and they may use them together. They may combine them together. One of the initial MAC lists that kind of came out in the marketplace was the Federal Upper Limits MAC list that HCFA, the Healthcare Financing Administration, now CMS, kind of put in place. So they put a HCFA MAC out in the marketplace to try to control the pricing initially of the generics. But when you looked at that HCFA MAC, it only covered about 60% of the generics that were going through. So if you had a MAC agreement with the PBM and they used HCFA MAC for you, only about 60% of those generic claims actually hit their MAC list. The rest of them all paid against your brand discount. So that can significantly impact your price. So you got to think about, am I getting a MAC guarantee from the PBM, or am I getting an overall generic guarantee, which we'll talk about? Because if you're getting simply a MAC guarantee, then the question is, how many of the generic claims actually pay against that MAC list? Now, so when we talked about, generics, though, the Hatch-Waxman Act gave generic manufacturers the ability to challenge a drug's patent. So as that patent starts to approach expiration of it, drug manufacturers were given the ability to file and challenge that patent. And if they won, the FDA gave them exclusive marketing rights for really 6 months for that generic. And that's what's really considered then a single source generic. They get this 6 months exclusivity when that comes out onto the marketplace. Now the brand manufacturer that's making that innovator brand product, they may also put a generic on the marketplace. And if they say they're going to take their brand product and put it in a bottle and label it with the generic name on it and put it in the market, those are considered authorized generics. That's kind of the difference. Think when Lipitor came off patent a couple years ago, right? Pfizer actually put an authorized generic out on the marketplace. So they took Lipitor, they put it in a bottle. They have a generic company that they worked with to actually put the generic Lipitor out onto the market under the atorvastatin name. That's the generic name for Lipitor, and marketed it that way. So there were really 2 generics that were out on the marketplace, but only one of them actually had a brand generic manufacturer that filed an abbreviated drug application, that ANDA that we talked about, to market and challenge the patent and win. Right? So the key here is that the authorized generic doesn't have an abbreviated new drug application. They've never had to file one. They only have a new drug application when they filed it to have Lipitor come to the market. So that's something that's really important to remember.
The single source and authorized generics are really important to really understand about how the PBM is going to price those for you as a client. I think that clearly where PBMs make the most money is on generic drugs, and I think that a lot of times if you get a pricing proposal from a PBM or even in your PBM contract, you may see language in there that says that the single source and authorized generics are excluded from the overall generic discounts. And that does have a real financial impact if you cannot get those included in your overall generic effective rate, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But the reality is if the PBM excludes single source and authorized generics from your overall generic discounts. It has, depending upon whether you're talking about mill discounts or retail discounts, anywhere from a 2 to 10% effect on your overall generic pricing if those are excluded by the PBMs. And again, as we talked about as I mentioned in the prior slide, understanding about what is included on the MAC list or what's included in those generic effective discounts is really, really important. Because as Greg had mentioned, before, typically single source and authorized generics will receive the brand discount and may be included in the overall brand discount, which is bad for you and good for the PBM. And this was, particularly interesting. I don't know if any of you, went through this exercise, but we went through it last year with several of our clients with respect to Nexium and whether or not it was better for the client to have Nexium kind of treated as a generic drug, as a single source generic, in their generic effective discount or versus a brand. And basically we came to the conclusion it was probably better for the client to be on continue to treat it as a generic drug as opposed to a brand, even with the discount and the rebate. So there's a lot of games, and I know that Crestor is going to be the same thing because Crestor goes generic next year.
Right.
And so that will have it'll be the same issue that a lot of you will face. And Greg, maybe you can talk a little bit about that issue and how it will come into play for next year when it comes to the price discounts.
Right, so I suspect for most of you, Crestor is in your top 5. If you cover Crestor, most likely it's in your top 5 drugs from a cost perspective. And so it is coming off patent next year. It's coming off generically. A drug manufacturer, generic guy, has challenged the patent and gotten exclusivity for it. So they'll have a 6-month exclusivity when that drug hits comes off patent and the generic gets released next year. So you really will have to sit down and do the math on that. How does that work for me with regard to, do I treat it as a generic in my system or treat it from a copay perspective? Because if you have, generic and brand copays, there's a pretty big differential on that of how that works. How does that cost shift affect you? All that has to get taken into consideration. You really got to look at, what's that Crestor going to cost me? I think philosophically, most clients want to say, generic is a generic, and I want to keep it as a generic and not try to confuse my employees, my members, on, treating it as a brand sometimes and as a generic as others. So that's all things you're going to have to consider when Crestor comes off. But Crestor really is kind of the last of the big kind of blockbuster brand drugs that are losing patent next year.
So how does MAC and non-MAC pricing affect your overall costs? As Greg pointed out, the MAC price is very significantly, between the different classes of generic drugs that make up or they're included on the PBM's particular MAC list. And a lot of times when you get a pricing proposal from a PBM or maybe even your current contract, you may have a non-MAC and a MAC generic discount rate. But again, those rates can vary, depending upon the MAC list. The MAC list is being used in terms of the AWP discounts that you may be receiving based upon that MAC pricing. And as we've said many times, that the non-MAC generics are typically discounted at the brand rates, which are not nearly as aggressive as a generic rate. And so it's important if you cannot get your PBM to include MAC and non-MAC generics into a single GER, that you negotiate probably as aggressive non-MAC discount as you possibly can. But the whole idea behind the generic effective rate is something that I think that hopefully most of you have moved to. I know that's something we try to negotiate on behalf of our clients all the time now. Is really the GER is looking at what is the utilization for both the MAC and non-MAC generics and coming up with an overall generic effective rate discount for all generics. So so there's no variability. We've even gone to started negotiating what we call flat generic discounts for clients when it comes to both MAC and non-MAC generics, simply because it's a lot easier for you to go ahead and manage your overall drug costs, because you know that if you have a flat generic, or if you don't have a flat but you have a GER, that you can kind of budget about what you think those generic drug costs will be based upon that generic rate. With a flat generic discount, all generics are going to pay at the same rate. Doesn't make any difference what that generic is. If the AWP is AWP minus 90 for one drug, but maybe AWP minus 50 for another, but your your applied generic effective discount is 75. It all balances out, but you know exactly what what you'll be paying for that generic drug. And where 88 to 90% of your claims will be on generics, it's really, really important that you know what generic rate you're going to be paying and trying to negotiate the most aggressive rate that you can, because, and there's a lot of variability in that generic discount, because again, the PBMs, they look at what they pay the retail pharmacy, what they're charging you, whether it's on a transparent or a spread basis, but negotiating an overall GER is really important for managing your drug costs.
So what are some, just briefly about some plan design things to help you increase generic utilization? With the generics being 88, 90%, especially when Crestor comes off, what are some key things from a plan design perspective you guys can think about? I think financially impacting the member is one of the best ways to get them to take a generic. And I suspect most of you have kind of a 3-tier copay structure in place, where you're looking at generics, preferred brands, and non-preferred brands. So the key really is then, for this presentation, right on the generic side, what's the difference between the generic copay and the brand copay? We like to see that to be at least $15, difference between them, $20, $25. The bigger that difference is, the more incentive that your members will have to take that generic utilization, or take that generic. If you have some sort of a percentage copay in place, where you have people pay 20%, or they have some sort of front-end deductibles kind of things, we really encourage a lot of our clients to really put in kind of a minimum copay of $10. And the reason we kind of look at $10 on that is because when you think about a $10 generic copay, about 40% of the generic claims will have a cost less than $10. So that means the cost to you as the payer for that will be zero. They'll be considered a zero balance due claim. You won't have to pay anything for that. So it's really a good way for you to help kind of control your costs by putting in, even though you have percentage copays, to putting in that minimum of, say, $10 on your generics is a good way to help you guys control costs. But dispense as written is another way to help kind of shift the cost to the members for that. What that really is it takes the cost difference between the brand drug and the generic and shifts that to the member. So they have to pick it up. If they want to get the brand, they have to pick up that cost difference. And there's some different DAW penalties, and different criteria that you can look at. Because in some cases, the physician may say, no, I don't want them to get the generic. And so the physician will tell the pharmacy that they can't substitute that brand for that generic for the brand. And the pharmacy will submit what's called a DAW code of 1. And then based on your plan design, though, your plan design still can decide whether or not you shift that cost difference to the member or not. That's still a plan design issue. It's just the pharmacy can't substitute it. But if the physician is okay with the member getting the generic, but the member doesn't want it, the member says, no, I want the brand, that becomes in, from a pharmacy perspective, a DAW code of 2. And then based on your plan design, you can decide whether or not you shift that cost difference to the member or not. The third scenario, though, is really the substitution not allowed by state law. That's one thing that I mentioned earlier, right? When you have these negative formularies, sometimes the state boards of pharmacy will say that these drugs are not substitutable. And in those cases, the pharmacies will submit a DAW code of 7, which is indicated for substitution not allowed by state law. But when you think about this cost difference, typically that cost difference between the brand and the generic is only calculated if the generic is on the PBM's MAC list. So if it doesn't qualify to be on the MAC list, or it hasn't reached the MAC list yet, there won't be any cost difference calculated, and there won't be any shift. So for example, Nexium finally came off patent this year. It came out as a single source generic, and stuff, so it didn't really hit on anybody's MAC list until just recently. So if you had DAW penalties in place, there wasn't any cost shifting taking place until it got on the PBM's MAC list, of which case it starts to get triggered. And that cost difference starts getting shifted to the member based on your plan design that you have in place. Now there is a strategy that a lot of the Medicaids use with regard to mandatory generic benefits, where they say they only cover the generic if there's a generic in a class of drugs. They only cover those generics. They'll no longer cover the brands. which is typically Medicaid's do that, and most employers don't go down that path, but that's clearly an option for you from a plan design perspective, is that you can do that, and to help really kind of drive that generic utilization. But overall, I think plan participant, member education is really important. If you have people currently that are on Crestor, when this is about ready to come off patent, to send out letters to them, letting them know that Crestor is coming off patent, the generic will be available, there'll be cost savings to them, typically through their copay for doing that. All that really helps encourage the generic utilization.
We'll talk a little bit about the generic drug price inflation, which a lot of you probably, as PBMs have for the last several years, have been really pushing generic drugs because generic drugs were always thought to be the most cost-effective drug as opposed to a brand. But in the last year or so, there have been a lot of, as many of you are aware, a lot of different generic drugs that have really increased in cost for several different reasons, which we're going to talk about. But this first bullet point here on this slide about the fact that generic drugs are increasing, and this is according to CMS, that from July 2013 to July 2014, the prices of more than 1,200 generic drugs increased by an average of 448%. And each one of you, and I noticed that 2/3 of you said, yes, I'm starting to see the impact of increased cost of generic drugs in my budget. Most of you probably will. If you haven't already experienced that, you're probably going to do that because at the end of the day, even though you have a generic discount, an AWP minus whatever your GER is, or your MAC discount or non-MAC, but at the end of the day, if that AWP price for that generic drug goes up, you're going to pay for it even though you have a really good discount. And there was a Nightline piece, I don't know if many of you, if you remember this or not, earlier this year, about a woman who had endometriosis who was taking the generic for Actig, and she was the piece was talking about how she was taking the generic fentanyl citrate, which at one time, when she started taking the medication in 2010, was 50 cents a tablet, or $1.50 a day. And then the manufacturer, somebody bought that manufacturer, and the cost of the generic version of Actig went up to $37.49 per dose times 3 times per day. So it went from $1.50 to well over $100. So one, the employer is paying that, and two, it's that is a lot of money when you start looking at some of these generic drugs in terms of the cost. The other one that I have as an example is doxycycline, which is an antibiotic which has been used a lot. Went from $20 a bottle to $1,800 a bottle. And in today's Wall Street Journal, colchicine, which is used for treatment of gout, went from 20 cents a tablet to $6 a tablet. So these are just some examples, and there's a lot of different examples out there of generic drugs that are widely used by people that have gone up in cost and will continue to, in certain circumstances, increase in cost as well. So why is this occurring? And a lot of it's because there is a limited supply of generic drugs. It used to be in many of these that many of these drugs, there were 3, 4, 5, 6 manufacturers, but over time they couldn't make any money. They decided it probably wasn't worthwhile to make these generic drugs anymore, so they got out. So they either sold to somebody else, and so you've had a lot of market consolidation as a result of fewer generic drug manufacturers in the market. And when you have fewer manufacturers, that means there's less supply that's available. And also I think that part of it is that some manufacturers or some people who have bought and gobbled up these generic drug manufacturers have understood that once they buy something, they kind of create a monopoly. And so it becomes much more difficult for the FDA because of all the different applications that they have, whether it be for biosimilars or just, specialty drugs or ANDAs or whatever. They just don't have enough resources to go ahead and respond to somebody else who wants to make a generic drug that used to be available in the market, but there's less of a supply because the number of manufacturers have decreased. And probably the one that is the biggest example is the Daraprim, which is the one that really sort of got everybody up in arms in Congress and a lot of different employers, which is the drug that was used for treating toxic plasmosis in newborns and AIDS patients, and went from $13.50 a tablet to $750 a tablet. And so those are the kinds of examples. I mean, yes, those are the extreme, but here, the guy that that owned the drug manufacturing company that decided to buy Daraprim thought, okay, well, I can raise the price to whatever I want, because he had his shareholders and people that he had to be concerned about without really thinking about the cost impact to employers or to individuals. And the other problem is you have fewer and fewer generic drugs or generic drug manufacturers. That means that certain generic drugs may no longer qualify to be on the MAC list, which is why it is really important to make sure that you have a generic effective rate for a client. And why won't it meet the definition of a MAC being included on the MAC list is because there may not be two or more generic manufacturers of that particular drug. So if that's the case, and if you're having to pay the brand discount on a drug that's gone up from $13.50 a tablet to $750, you're going to be paying a lion's share of that cost of those particular drugs that are may no longer may be available. In terms of the next slide about strategies to mitigate the increase in cost of generic drugs, what can you do? I think one thing that you need to do is you need to monitor the deletion of generic drugs from a PBM's MAC list. One of the things that we have started including in our client contracts is asking for the PBM to provide a list of adds and deletes from their MAC list on a monthly basis. It's one of those things that Greg monitors fairly closely in terms of understanding, what is going on with respect to pricing. Even if you don't have this in your contract now, I would highly encourage you to approach your PBM and ask them about, what kind of list or what kind of report can you get from them regarding the deletion of generics from that PBM's MAC list. The question is, if there is a drug that's deleted, why? If it is deleted, then how is that going to impact you from a cost standpoint, particularly if you have MAC and non-MAC pricing? Because if it's deleted from the MAC list, that means you can probably pretty well bet that drug is no longer going to be priced as a generic, it's going to be priced as a brand. So if you have a GER, it probably makes less difference, but it also helps you understand what could happen, or you can ask the PBM, why is this being deleted, and what impact will this have on me by the fact that it's no longer included on your MAC list. The other thing we started to see this year as a part of our contract negotiations is that some PBMs are trying to exclude the high-cost generics from generic pricing guarantees. I think particularly with the drug, the drug that was for toxic plasmosis, if that's a generic drug, how does that then get treated as opposed to the overall generic effective rate? But I think you're going to see a lot more PBMs are going to try to exclude these high-cost generic drugs from their GER. And so I think it's one of those things that you need to be mindful of, and you need to have a discussion about how that is going to impact your pricing. I think the other thing you need to start asking yourself or asking the PBM is to let you know when a generic drug has had more than 100% price increase. And this is important because if the drug jumps up, all at once you're going to be paying the cost based upon the AWP discount. And part of it is it just helps you understand about, okay, if this drug has gone up, this particular generic drug has gone up 100%, is there another generic drug that's available that I could possibly have my member consider taking? Is there some kind of plan design I may want to consider where I'm not going to cover this particular generic? If there's another generic drug that may be available in that particular class. So again, it's information that's important for you to have in terms of when these drugs go up. We've had some clients say, look, I want to know if it goes up at 50%. I need to plan ahead. But I think clearly if there's a huge price increase on some of these generic drugs, you need to know about it. And what are you going to do about it in consultation with your PBM, with your consultant, with your HR people, whatever. But what plans are you going to make if in fact those generic drugs go up in cost? Again, we've talked a lot about this, about making sure that your non-MAC generics are not treated priced as a brand discount, because if they are, you're going to be paying that additional cost, because the brand discount, as we all know, is not as good as the generic discount. And I think that the other thing is, looking at and considering, especially with the number of generics out there, particularly where they're increasing in cost, do you want to consider implementing a preferred and non-preferred generic copay? Particularly where these drugs are generically available in the class, category, and class, and they're therapeutically available to do basically the same thing, for the member. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's a generic drug that is half the cost of one that has gone up 100%, you may want to consider looking at developing that preferred and non-preferred generic copay as a way of, again, helping control costs. And one, it would require the member to pay more if they wanted to take the more expensive generic. But it's something for you to consider. The other thing is, yeah.
Just one moment, please. I'm sorry. Just wanted to mute everyone again. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. And so it's important when you're looking at considering a preferred and non-preferred generic copay, is really asking your PBM, is there an alternative generic drug in that same category and class that could be substituted for the drug that's increased to 100% or whatever that cost may be? And the example I gave here is really the pravastatin, which increased from $27 to $196. Is there another alternative cholesterol-lowering drug that you should consider that would be less expensive? So again, this is all information for you to be thinking about as there are more and more manufacturers, I should say, fewer manufacturers of certain generic drugs that your people have been taking, that you have, again, gone the generic route or encouraging generics because you think that that's a way to help you control your costs.
Yeah, if you think about it, so if you have someone that's on pravastatin, old Pravachol and stuff, even on, the Walmart $4 list, those $4 lists that are out there, generic Mevacor is $4, right? So instead of paying $196 for that, you could have your members pay $4 for a relatively equivalent drug, right, the therapeutically equivalent drug, generic Mevacor, and pay $4, of which then the cost to you as a client would be zero in most cases.
The other thing that I think that either you can do, but I would encourage you to have your PBM do it, is really kind of report the generic drugs where there are shortages. Again, like I said, that this is one of those things we've seen this year where PBMs, if there are even shortages of certain generic drugs, they've been trying to exclude those from the generic pricing guarantees as well. There are really two websites that either you or particularly the PBM can actually refer to determine whether or not there is a drug that's in short supply, particularly as it relates to generic, and that's the FDA and the American Society of Hospital Pharmacy website. And as I noted here, that in Q3 2015, there are actually 190 drugs that are in active shortage. A lot of these are used in hospitals, that is true, but there are some of these that are actually typical generic drugs that people use. And again, it's information for you to have, that if you have PBMs that start excluding generic drugs or in short supply from your generic pricing guarantees, you need to know how that could impact you, because it's allowing you to make a decision about, is there another alternative that member could take? What is the PBM doing to make sure that this shortage does not last very long? How long does this shortage impact your guarantee, your generic pricing guarantee? All those things are really important, but there's information, there are tools that are available that you should ask your PBM to provide you to kind of make sure that you're in the loop on things that are going on. The other thing is and again, Greg had to do this for a couple clients when it came to looking at certain generic drugs where they started getting very expensive. You got to do the math. I mean, is it cheaper, even though you may have a very, very good generic discount at retail and mail, is it actually cheaper for you to consider going the brand route when you take into account only your brand discount plus the rebate? In some circumstances, depending upon what that AWP cost is for that generic drug, it may be cheaper. And so you have to do the math to go ahead and at the end of the day say, you know what, whether it's through a step therapy or whatever you may have, I may need to switch this. I may need to go back and say, look, I'm going to pay for the brand as opposed to generic because it's actually cheaper for me as an employer and the payer to do that. So in each of these situations, if you encounter a situation where there's been a huge increase on a generic drug, looking at the brand cost, factoring in the rebate is something that you need to do. It's interesting. The guy, Martin, I can't remember his name, the guy that bought the Daraprim that went from $1,350 to $750. He tried to call it, quote unquote, a specialty drug, even though that drug had been on the market and had been considered a generic since 1950. So, so the question is does the trend of buying old drugs and remarketing them as costly specialty drugs necessarily mean they are specialty drugs? I would argue that it does not. And I think it's important that again, and we've had to relook at this even in terms of our definition of what a specialty drug is. And just because somebody who buys a generic drug and decides to jack up the price to, $350,000 a year does not necessarily mean that makes it a specialty drug. And I think that's a discussion that, we're having right now for even our current contracts that go into effect next year, is trying to be very specific as to whether these drugs will still be considered a generic or a specialty drug. It's really important because the generic drug discount is a heck of a lot better than the specialty drug discount. And just because a manufacturer decides to call it a specialty drug does not necessarily make it a specialty drug just because it's expensive or it's a costly drug. And I think that's one of those things where I think that with PBMs, they haven't encountered this either in terms of, well, what do we do? I mean, they don't want to necessarily, if they're giving a big generic discount, of course, I mean, it's a potential that they could lose money. So this is one of those things I think that as a client you need to be thinking about in terms of these scenarios about, these high-cost generic drugs which are now in short supply or where manufacturers bought a company and now there's only one or less than or maybe two generic manufacturers. Does that necessarily make that a specialty drug? I think that the best piece of advice I can give you today when it comes to the high-cost generics is to plan ahead. You have to monitor the price, and you have to think about if this were to occur, what kind of strategies am I going to implement? What you don't want to do is get caught behind the eight ball, and once you've got a lot of high-cost drug claims that are coming through, that you're going, wait a second, why is this drug now X? And then you're having to play catch up, or you're having to try to figure out what you're going to do, and then it creates member noise. So I think that it's important to kind of think about what you need to do from a plan standpoint and from a payer standpoint to try to get ahead of the curve in terms of how to respond to these generic drugs which have been skyrocketing in price. Okay, we're going to talk. Greg's going to talk a little bit now about biosimilars, but we had a question.
Keep dragging out there.
Are you talking about the poll, Michael?
Thing.
What's that?
The poll?
Can you put that out?
Yeah.
Pull that poll out. So do you think the introduction of biosimilars in the U.S. will reduce your specialty drug costs? Wow, almost everyone says no. 100% here. Yeah, it's kind of surprising. So when you think about the specialty drugs as they come to the marketplace, right? When you think about a biosimilar, the specialty drugs in general are really they're therapeutically similar to the innovator originator brand drug, but since they're really brewed, they're really these proteins that end up being kind of brewed as opposed to a chemical entity that gets manufactured. They're truly not generically substitutable. So they could be therapeutically substitutable, right, as we talked about before, but they won't be bioequivalent or generically substituted for. Now, the Affordable Care Act did give a pathway, right, for approval of these biological products that'll show to be biosimilar or highly similar, right, and somewhat interchangeable then with that FDA licensed approved biological product. So, the specialty drug pipeline is pretty robust. There's a lot of people, a lot of the big drug manufacturers now are trying to produce specialty drugs, and there's about 39 or so that are going to be starting to lose their patent protection fairly soon. Copaxone already has lost its patent protection, and there's a biosimilar available for that. Neupogen, right, which is used to increase white blood cell counts in people that are on cancer treatment, right? That last March lost its patent protection, and a biosimilar got put onto the market. But it got put out on the market is called Xarexio, so kind of as a brand name drug, which is exactly what we think most of these biosimilars are going to be. They're not going to come out as a generic. They're going to come out as a brand, and they may be discounted in some respects, 10, 15, 20% of cost below the originator innovator product, but they'll still be a brand. And I think as more and more of the manufacturers start to put these out there, the big key is going to be, I think, from a rebate perspective. Since they will be brand drugs, what kind of rebates will the manufacturers put on these to help drive market share to their product? To incent from a rebate perspective, from a cost perspective, to encourage the use of that. Now, there could be some plan design things that you can put into place as these biosimilars come to marketplace. There could be some step therapy programs that you put in place. Let's say you need to use the biosimilar first before you use the originator brand. They can also be prior authorized, right? So when that first prescription gets written for the originator, it could get stopped and ask the physician then to prior authorize it of why they won't accept the biosimilar in a way to kind of help lower costs. But I think in general, right, these will be considered brands in the marketplace, I think, and end up having brand copays. So I think for some of you, you have to think about, do I want to do kind of a specialty copay, which is what we're starting to recommend for a lot of our clients anyway, a specialty drug copay that takes into account some of these things. But I think the one thing you got to remember, though, the caveat on all this is that these biosimilars are just that. They're similar to the originator brand. So the members may have to switch back to the originator if it's not working well enough for them, because they're not exactly the same drug. They're similar and very similar, highly similar, but they're not exactly the same drug.
Yeah, I think that the impact of the biosimilars and future drug costs it remains to be seen. I've read a lot of different articles, and I think that, for example, there are some people that say that some articles are saying that the employers may see a reduction of 2.6 to 7.6% of their drug spend because of the introduction of biosimilars. CMS is saying, well, the pricing of biosimilars should be about 15 to 30% lower than the reference biologic. But again, I think that and there are other people are now like 11 different biosimilars which are in the pipeline for approval. Most of these are for targeting cancer, and there are estimates that it could save about $250 billion over the next decade if these 11 biosimilars enter the marketplace. But I think that the actual value and the actual cost savings remains to be seen. For example, it takes a while for these biosimilars to get approved, and the question is, for example, if you take like a Hep C, it doesn't make sense to think that there would even be a biosimilar because, by the time that most people probably, if they get their Harvoni, Sovaldi, or Vicurapac, I mean, if there's not very many people left to cure a particular disease state, there may not be a lot of people trying to get into that particular biosimilar market. Now, there probably will be on cancer, and there probably could be on some for MS and probably for rheumatoid arthritis. But again, if a lot of these blockbuster specialty drugs, which are really for orphan drug conditions, which only target a small number of people, you may not see biosimilars in some of these particular disease states, which are very expensive. And so I think that the use of biosimilars and whether, how they're received by the payers, particularly you, the employer, if there's really not a big cost savings or a rebate difference or whatever between the biologic brand drug, that remains to be seen. I mean, if it's not that big of a price difference, as Greg mentioned, these are brewed. These are not like the generic that you can get for cholesterol lowering or something else. Everybody could react a little bit differently to a biologic. So I think that a lot of these biosimilar companies, I mean, they understand that, they're not necessarily, I don't think, Greg, looking at these as being like a generic drug. I mean, they look at this totally different, and it's sort of an alternative to the brand, but it's still kind of a brand. And so, in terms of the cost, we're just not sure. But I do think that in PBMs, when it comes to formularies, and you as a client, an employer, when it comes to your benefit design, you're just going to have to keep monitoring the situation, as we will for our clients, about what it means when there's a biosimilar that comes out. What is it going to be priced as? What are the rebates? What are do you need to do some kind of a step therapy, for different biosimilars? Provided they're acceptable treatment and they work, at the end of the day, it's the same thing you're doing. You're, between a brand and a generic, what you're going to have to do between the biologic and the biosimilar is comparing to make sure that it makes sense to pay for that, and and how do you structure your plan design to cover those.
So in summary from our presentation here today, right, when you think about the key takeaways that we'd like for you guys to remember, that A-rated generic drugs are bioequivalent to that innovator brand drug. They are substitutable. There's just a few exceptions, right, with regard to some states, some state board of pharmacies that have these negative formularies, but in general, the A-rated generics are substitutable. Pharmacies can substitute those, put them through, but the physician initially does have to give the pharmacy authorization to do it, but in most states, that's pretty liberal for the physician to authorize the generic use. A MAC is a price, right? It's not a discount. It's a price on a per tablet, per capsule basis that's given to a generic drug, and it's usually grouped together in a class, right? So there's this class of generic drugs that are grouped together, and they all get the same price. And then those multiple classes are put on a MAC list, and that's really where you get this whole list comprising for. But PBMs in general have multiple MAC lists. Please don't ever think that a PBM only has one MAC list, because that's just typically not how that works. They manage multiple MAC lists to try to make sure that they can meet their pricing obligations that they have. A key thing for you to do is try to negotiate an overall generic effective rate that includes both single source generics and authorized generics, and non-MAC generics and MAC generics, right? You want to include all the generic claims in your discount, as opposed to the PBM saying, well, these aren't excluded, these are excluded, we don't count these high cost ones, right? That all starts to really distort the overall value that either your consultant or your broker or yourself may have negotiated with your PBM. Generic price inflation, it may cause the brand drug to actually be less expensive. A lot of you are going to get rebates now are on a per brand basis. So if you've got a brand drug coming through, you're going to get a rebate on it, even though there's a generic available. So as the generic prices continue to go up and they start to challenge the price of that, the AWP of the brand, you got to really look at that. Does that make sense for me to continue covering that generic, especially if you're giving them a generic copay, relative to saying I'm going to cover the brand at a brand copay and get the rebate for that. And lastly, when you think about biosimilars, they're not biogenerics, they're biosimilars, and they're not bioequivalent to that innovator brand biological drug, right? They aren't directly substitutable. They can be therapeutically interchanged, but again, there's plan designs, with regard to step therapies or prior authorizations that would need to be in place to encourage the use of those biosimilars, which hopefully when they come to the market will be less expensive and will help control your costs.
We're out of time. I don't know if we have any time for questions, Kelly, or not. If you have questions, you can always submit them. We'll be happy to respond to them offline. But we appreciate you listening in on our presentation today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg and Michael, and thank you, audience. I'm afraid that we don't have time for the questions right at this moment, but if you did submit questions, Michael and Greg can be in touch with you, and also they'll be sending the presentation out, so you'll get an email from them, and you can ask them any questions you have directly. And be sure to join us next year. Check our website for a conference that might work for your calendar, and check back for more webinars. We offer them throughout the winter. So we look forward to seeing you next year, and thank you again, Michael and Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.